Hello and welcome back to Dear Jordan. This is a space where I slow down and put words to the lessons life teaches quietly. The ones that don't come with warnings, the ones you usually don't understand until the consequences are already standing right in front of you. Today's letter is about responsibility. It's about the importance of choosing wisely when doing things that have the potential to create life. About understanding that some decisions don't end when the moment does. They don't fade when feelings change. They don't disappear just because we weren't ready for what followed. This letter isn't meant to scare you, and it isn't meant to judge anyone. It's meant to slow down the conversation because culturally, we rush past these realities. We talk about attraction, chemistry, and desire, but we rarely talk about permanence, about emotional maturity, about what it actually takes to co-create a life with another human being. This is a letter written from experience, from reflection, from lessons learned the long way. So grab yourself a cup of coffee and listen in. Dear Jordan, have you ever seen those pregnancy test commercials, the ones where the woman waits for the result, holding her breath, and then suddenly she's smiling, sometimes crying, while her partner wraps her up in a hug like they just won the lottery? I hate those commercials. Not because there's anything inherently wrong with joy, but because I never had that moment. Every pregnancy test I took came with anxiety instead of excitement, fear instead of reassurance, a deep, heavy awareness that I was standing on the edge of something life-altering without the safety or support that moment is supposed to come with. And here's the part that makes it even more confusing. I was a married woman, having babies, building a family, doing everything in order people love to praise and encourage. Yet finding out I was pregnant was rarely celebrated. There were no breath-held smiles or shared tears, no sense of we're in this together, just silence, tension, the quiet understanding that I was about to carry not just a child, but the weight of what came next, mostly alone. My first pregnancy test showed a lightning-fast result at 5 a.m. I remember feeling both elated and terrified at the same time. My partner had no reaction, none. The silence in that moment said more than words ever could. The second pregnancy test came after me hugging the toilet, already sick, already knowing. My partner looked annoyed, not surprised, not concerned, just irritated that I was pregnant. By the third pregnancy, there was excitement, just not for me. I had learned by then that excitement didn't always mean safety, and I was right. That excitement turned out to be a distraction, a way to keep me from seeing the truth of what was actually happening. The fourth test was a complete shock. No celebration, no reaction from either of us. Just the quiet understanding that life had changed again, without ceremony, without reassurance. Nothing like the commercials. And that was a hard thing to carry, because bringing life into the world should feel sacred. It should feel safe. It should feel supported. It should feel celebratory. And when it doesn't, something inside you takes note, even if you don't yet have the words for it. That's why I want you to be incredibly choosy about who you decide to create life with. Dating is one thing, and it belongs in a category all its own. Getting to know people, spending time together, traveling, sharing experiences, that's a part of living. That's a part of learning who you are and how you connect to others. But sometimes dating leads to intimate settings where sex feels imminent. And sex, whether people want to admit it or not, always carries the possibility of creating life. There was a television series called I Didn't Know I Was Pregnant, where women shared stories about not realizing they were pregnant until labor. What always struck me, what was never needed to be said. The episodes didn't begin with, "So, did you have sex?" Because that question alone clears up the entire mystery. Pregnancy, outside of the virgin birth, always begins the same way. No matter how carefully you plan, no matter how diligently you prevent, sex is what makes it possible. I know this because I lived it. I was 35 years old, diagnosed with PCOS, on birth control, limiting sex, doing everything responsibly, and I still got pregnant with my fourth child, all made possible by one thing: sex. I was sitting in my doctor's office for what should have been a routine appointment, there simply to renew my birth control prescription. Instead, the system kept flagging something unexpected, over and over again. It showed that I was pregnant. My doctor looked at me and asked, almost casually, "So, are you pregnant?" As far as I knew, I wasn't, but the system's insistence made me pause. It planted that question I hadn't been asking. So I checked on my own, and there it was, pregnant, clear as day on the digital screen. Now that's not moral commentary, that's biology, and yet we treat sex like it's casual, like it's a moment, a feeling, a night, when in reality, it has the power to become a lifetime, a child, a responsibility, a bond that doesn't dissolve just because the relationship does. Psychology actually supports this in ways we don't like to talk about. Sex releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone. It creates emotional attachment whether we consciously intend it or not. Our brains don't separate physical intimacy from emotional meaning as cleanly as culture pretends they do. Even when we tell ourselves it's just physical, our nervous system doesn't agree. Scripture understood this long before neuroscience ever named the chemical. The two shall become one flesh wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was truth about attachment, union, and consequence, not just spiritually, but relationally, physically, psychologically. And still, we minimize it. We talk about sex as freedom, but rarely as responsibility, as pleasure, but not as power, as personal choice without acknowledging the permanent ties it can create. I waited until I was married because I believed that was the safest way. I believed it would protect me. I believed it meant I was doing everything, quote unquote, right. I didn't even leave room for the possibility that things could go wrong because I thought obedience automatically meant security. But the Bible never promises that marriage alone prevents harm. It speaks more about wisdom than legality, discernment more than titles, fruit more than appearances, and yet here I am, divorced, living single with 4 kids. Not because I did everything wrong, but because doing things in order is not the same as doing them wisely. I don't think I considered deeply enough who I was creating children with. I also didn't fully grasp the weight of creating individual lives, human beings who would one day think for themselves, challenge my beliefs, and possibly disagree with everything I say. But that's a conversation for another letter. This conversation is about taking seriously who you choose to lay down with, because that decision carries far more consequence than we're ever taught to admit. Having a child with someone doesn't just create a baby, it creates a lifetime connection, one that doesn't disappear just because the relationship ends, one that doesn't dissolve when love fades, resentment grows, or you realize you chose wrong. Scripture is clear about this, even when we aren't. What we join matters. What we bind ourselves to has lasting consequences. The Bible speaks often about wisdom in choosing partners, not just for love, but for life. Can two walk together unless they are agreed? Isn't about perfection. It's about alignment, direction, character. Because when you have a child with someone, you are choosing their emotional maturity, or lack of it. You're choosing how conflict will be handled. You're choosing whether communication will be calm or chaotic. You're choosing whether disagreements turn into conversations or into battlegrounds. Psychology tells us that children don't learn emotional regulation from what parents say. They learn it from what parents model, how adults manage stress, disagreement, disappointment, and accountability becomes the blueprint a child uses to understand relationships. Long before a child understands words, their nervous system is learning whether the world feels safe or unpredictable. And sometimes what you're really choosing is whether your child will grow up watching 2 adults navigate life with respect or spend years caught in the middle of tension, bitterness, and unresolved hurt. Because it's not just about custody schedules or child support or logistics. It's about emotional safety. It's about whether both parents can put their ego aside and say, this is no longer about me. This is about our child. That's where emotional intelligence matters most. When that's missing, everything becomes harder. Simple conversations turn into power struggles, decisions turn into arguments, co-parenting turns into control, and the child becomes the silent witness to two people who never learned how to regulate their emotions, communicate with maturity, or separate personal pain from parental responsibility. And the truth is, it doesn't just affect the two people who made the child. It ripples outward to grandparents, to siblings, to new partners, to entire families who get pulled into the tension whether they want to be or not. That's why choosing who you create life with is one of the most serious decisions you will ever make. Not because people don't change, they do, but because once a child exists, there is no clean break, no reset button, no walking away without consequences. You're tied together in some way, forever. And that reality deserves more than we're often taught to give. And even when someone walks away completely, when they choose absence over responsibility, that absence still carries weight. Because doing it alone isn't freedom, it's survival. When someone disappears, you don't just lose a partner, you lose shared responsibility. You lose backup, you lose the ability to rest, to tap out, to say, I can't do this today. Everything becomes heavier because it all lands on one set of shoulders. Every decision, every emergency, every late night, every moment of doubt. And while people love to romanticize the idea of strong single parents, the truth is, strength born from necessity is exhausting. It's not something to aspire to. It's something you endure. Raising a child alone doesn't just mean doing double the work. It means carrying the emotional weight of two people while trying not to let your child feel the absence of one. It means being both the comfort and the authority, the nurturer and the disciplinarian, the soft place to land and the structure that holds everything together. Now here's where I think there holds an exception. If you're in an environment where you constantly experience some form of abuse, whether that is verbal abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, physical abuse, that is one scenario where I think being alone in the raising of a child is a better option. Remember, your child absorbs the environment they are around. Their nervous system is affected in silence and in loudness. That puts stress on them because they're constantly on guard, their nervous system ready for fight or flight. That isn't healthy. Chronic stress creates cortisol and disrupts the body long before the child understands what's happening. And it doesn't just affect them, it affects you. You're always on guard for the next ball to drop, and that constant vigilance drains the body, clouds judgment, and turns everyday life into survival mode. Scripture speaks often about peace as a form of protection, not comfort, peace. A calm environment where growth is possible, where fear doesn't dominate, where love doesn't come with conditions or threats. So yes, raising a child alone is hard, but raising a child in an abusive environment is harder. Because in that scenario, everyone is bleeding quietly and calling it normal. And again, that's why who you choose to create life with matters so deeply. Not just for love, not just for companionship, but for safety, for peace, for the nervous systems and the future of the lives you bring into this world. And this is where emotional maturity really comes into focus. Because emotional maturity isn't about being calm all the time or never making mistakes. It's about what you do when things get uncomfortable. It's about whether you can separate your feelings from your responsibilities, whether you can sit with discomfort without turning it into chaos for everyone around you. Emotionally mature people understand that hurt doesn't give you permission to harm, that disappointment doesn't justify destruction, that anger doesn't excuse cruelty. When you have a child with someone, emotional maturity means recognizing that your relationship with that person may end, but your responsibility to your child does not. It means being able to communicate without weaponizing your pain. It means knowing when to pause, when to listen, and when to put your ego aside for the sake of someone who didn't ask to be born into the middle of conflict. Immaturity, on the other hand, turns every disagreement into a battlefield. It turns co-parenting into competition. It turns children into messengers, leverage, or emotional shields. And the damage from that doesn't always show up right away, but it shows up eventually. Children learn how to love by watching how the adults in their lives handle conflict. They learn what respect looks like, what accountability looks like, what emotional safety feels like. When that foundation is unstable, it shapes how they see themselves and what they come to accept from others. Emotional maturity matters more than charm, more than chemistry, more than how good someone makes you feel in the moment. Maturity is what determines whether your child grows up in chaos or in consistency. And that's something worth thinking about long before anyone says, "We're pregnant." So how do you recognize emotional maturity before it's too late? It shows up in the small moments, not in the big gestures. Emotionally mature people take responsibility without being forced to. They can apologize without turning it into a defense. They don't need to win every argument or prove that they're right. They can sit with discomfort without lashing out or shutting down. They don't make you feel small for having needs, and they don't punish you for expressing them. They understand that accountability isn't an attack. It's a necessary part of growth. Emotionally mature people can disagree without trying to destroy you. They can hear no without seeing it as rejection. They don't view boundaries as betrayal. And when they mess up, they don't make you carry the emotional cleanup. When you choose wrong, though, when you build a life with someone who lacks that maturity, the consequences don't always show up right away. Sometimes they creep in slowly, communication becomes strained, small issues turn into power struggles, support turns into control, love becomes conditional. And when children are involved, the impact deepens. Because now you're not just managing your own emotions, you're trying to protect a child from the emotional fallout of someone else's unresolved issues. You're trying to create stability in an environment that feels unpredictable. You're trying to be calm in a storm you didn't create. And again, that's why choosing who you create life with is one of the most life-altering decisions you will ever make. It's not just about love in the moment or chemistry that feels intoxicating. It's about who that person becomes when things are hard. It's about how they handle conflict, responsibility, disappointment, and change. It's about whether they can show up not only for you, but for a child who didn't ask to be here and depends on both of you to do better than your emotions sometimes allow. Because once a child exists, every choice you make echoes forward. It shapes how that child understands love, safety, communication, and self-worth. It influences how they handle conflict, how they trust others, and how they learn to treat themselves. Choosing someone to create life with is choosing a co-author for your child's story, even if that person eventually exits the chapter. And while you can't control how someone else shows up, you can choose awareness. You can choose intention. You can choose to think beyond the moment and into the lifetime that follows. That's why this choice deserves more than attraction, more than hope, more than potential. It deserves honesty, emotional maturity, and the courage to slow down long enough to ask the hard questions. Because the decision doesn't end when the relationship does. It lives on in the life you helped create. Jordan, I want something different for you. I want the moment you take a pregnancy test, if you ever choose that path, to be filled with love, not fear, with excitement, not calculation, with safety, not silence. I want you to feel held in that moment, supported, certain that the person beside you understands the weight of what you're about to create and is willing to carry it with you. Not perfectly, but responsibly, emotionally, faithfully. I want that moment to feel like hope, not survival, because life deserves to be welcomed with joy. And you deserve a partner who understands the sacred responsibility of creating it with you. I say this with all the love that I am still learning how to give. Sincerely, your mom. Thank you for sitting with me through this letter. I know this wasn't light, it wasn't meant to be. Some conversations matter too much to rush through or soften or comfort. This was one of them. If you're listening and parts of this felt familiar, heavy, or close to home, know this. Awareness is not condemnation. Reflection is not failure. And learning something late doesn't mean it's useless. It means it's earned. These letters are never about telling anyone what to do. They're about naming what's real, so we can choose differently when we still have the chance. And if nothing else, I hope this letter gives language to a truth that's often felt but rarely said out loud. Until next time, be gentle with yourself and don't rush the choices that echo forward. This has been Dear Jordan, Letters to My Daughter.